if you think about combat sports in general, it's definitely there is definitely a lot of variation in terms of evolvability. The rate of change that you see in Jiu-Jitsu over the past few decades is unparalleled if you compare that, for instance, with Muay Thai or with boxing and things like that. I'm not saying that those sports didn't evolve and didn't change quite a bit, but comparably, I would say that no one would doubt that the rate of change has been super faster. And I would say that the reason why Jiu-Jitsu has been so much more evolvable is precisely because the way we organized different guards and different submissions and different sweeps in a way that you can recombine them, and not only that you can adapt that to the body type of different people. If you're short and stocky, probably a guillotine choke don't work as well against you than for some other guy that's tall and with a big neck and things like that.
So, ladies and gentlemen, a lot of you know me because of my background in the martial arts and my fascination with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. What a lot of people don't know is that in my undergraduate degree was in ecology, evolution, and animal behavior. And today on the line, direct from Brazil, from the University of Paraná, we have Marcio Pie. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yes.
How would you pronounce it?
Marcio Pie.
Pie. Okay, so I had the accent on the emphasis on the wrong syllable. So Marcio, you're a professor of evolution. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, I'm a professor. Yeah, at the zoology department of the university here.
Okay, and you're also a jiu-jitsu practitioner.
Yeah.
So we got in the conversation on Twitter about the parallels of evolution in life, in the animal kingdom, in the plant kingdom, and bacterial kingdom. I don't know if kingdoms are used anymore, and jiu-jitsu. Mm-hmm. So can you lay out what you'd like to talk about today? Kind of maybe start with defining evolution. What is evolution?
Sure. There's many different ways that people have defined evolution, but I would say that in a nutshell, evolution is the process of change in life over the course of their history on Earth. And I think people sort of consolidated three main principles that underlie biological evolution in general. These principles are variation, heritability, and selection.
Inheritability, meaning that my genes go down to the next generation, that I pass something on.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So variation could take place in biology. It takes place with processes like mutation, recombination, things like that. Heritability, which is transmission, as you said, transmission of genes to the next generations, and selection, which is simply natural selection. And many authors actually believe that once you have these three principles in place, evolution is sort of a logical necessity. The late Stephen Jay Gould would say that whatever system you're thinking about, either cultural evolution, technological evolution, or biological evolution, whenever you have these three principles, you're necessarily going to have evolution.
Okay. Could you give us a simple biological example of where you have variation, inheritability, and natural selection, and just give us an example of how that. What's your favorite biological system? Every biologist has a system. Are you a Drosophila, a fruit fly guy? Are you?
No, I'm more of a field guy. I've been working on many different types of organisms in different places. I've been working on miniaturized frogs in the Atlantic rainforest, cavefish in southwestern China. Frogs from Sri Lanka and many different places, but there's so many really neat examples of how this can happen. Let me give you a simple example that's very interesting from North America. Basically, you have newts or salamanders. These are amphibians that have a really strong toxin. It's a very potent toxin called tetrodotoxin. Basically, it paralyzes your breathing muscles. So basically, you'll choke to death if you start feeding on these guys. But in some snake species, they are able to detoxify, and they have a mutation that allows them to be immune to this toxin. So what happens is in populations where you have the salamander, the snakes are gonna feed on the salamanders. But it turns out that mutation is not particularly good because it makes their metabolism not to work so well. So in places where there is no salamander, the same species will revert to being susceptible. So basically, you have this arms race. Whenever you have the prey, the predator is going to evolve an adaptation against the anti-predation strategy. But when the dangerous prey is not present, it will revert back to the sort of natural condition. So basically, whenever you have variation in terms of, I think I would say the most the easiest way to think about this is perhaps like a hare in the prairies or something like that, where we're going to have inherently some are going to be faster than others. Some are going to be slower, some are going to be faster, and the predator is going to preferentially prey on the slowest ones. And over time, this process inevitably is going to lead to faster and faster this arms race. But even in this case, there's an interesting asymmetry because natural selection is much stronger on the prey than in the predator, because the prey is running for its life, but the predator is just running for its dinner. So there's all sorts of really interesting dynamics there.
But in the example of an animal that learns to run faster because it's being chased, and learning is the wrong word, where we've got 100 rabbits and 10 of them are really fast, 10 of them are really slow, and 80 of them are normal speed. And then the predators get most of the slow ones and some of the medium speed ones and very few of the fast ones. Why don't just all rabbits learn to run at light speed? Why aren't all rabbits cheetahs? Why don't they all run at 100 miles an hour all the time? So what's stopping them from just a runaway kind of selection?
That's a really interesting question. The main reason is that you have trade-offs. So you can be the best you can in one particular condition or in one particular thing in your across all the biological characteristics of a species, but eventually the optimal in one situation is going to be not so optimal in another. So you can compare that, for instance, if the Olympics would be very different if every athlete had to compete for every single sport. All of a sudden, the big guy in weightlifting wouldn't be so good, for instance, in table tennis. And when you have different, the same pressures applied across the entire population, then all of a sudden, what's the ideal in one situation is going to be bad in another situation. So you're going to have these trade-offs.
So in the example of the rabbits, the price that they have to pay for running faster might be that they have to have super high bone density and that takes more energy to make. So then they're putting energy into bone density instead of baby rabbits.
Exactly. Or some super high metabolism that makes them get hungrier faster, for instance.
So what's happening with the snakes? Why don't the snakes eating the poisonous salamanders, why don't they all have the ability to eat the poisonous salamanders? What's the trade-off there?
So basically, I think part of this people sort of understand or learn in school, which is the sodium-potassium channels in their muscle cells. Basically, you have, or in their nervous cells in general, basically you have these chemicals that go across the cell membranes to for instance, have muscle contraction or to have neurons transmit information. And basically, this toxin is going to jam that sodium channel and will make that less efficient or basically block that. And the snakes that have this mutation, they are immune to the toxin, but in a sense, their protein is a bit screwed up. It's not as efficient as the regular ones. So basically, you have the best strategy depends on the context.
Which is really beginning to get us to jiu-jitsu, isn't it? I mean, should you pull guard in a competition? Well, it depends. Should you go for a leg lock? Well, it depends. If you're going against Pao Miao, probably not.
But this also brings us to another interesting question, which is this same idea was brought up by some authors. For instance, there are some people that have this thought experiment about like a Darwinian demon that would be basically best in everything and would outcompete any other species, and it would be very little diversity in a sense. So there's two reasons why both in Jiu-Jitsu we haven't converged into a very small number of throws and submissions and chokes and things like that. One is the thing that we mentioned before, which is you start going to have trade-offs, but perhaps more importantly, the best strategy is going to depend on what other individuals in the population are doing. That's what we see in biology in many areas. Actually, this is a relatively old area that was started back in the 40s by people like John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern. Is what people call in economics people call game theory. And over the years, people might actually remember this from that Russell Crowe movie, Beautiful Mind, a few years ago. Basically, is the idea that there might not be one best strategy every time. You might have the best strategy might depend on what other individuals and populations are doing. For instance, one simple game that people use, like one simple thought experiment that people use, is the idea of the hawk-dove game. You can imagine these are named for strategies, not necessarily different species. But imagine, for instance, that everyone in population has a hawk strategy, which means that they're really aggressive. Whenever they meet each other, they'll fight almost to death. And if they see a resource, they're going to fight to death and going to get injured and so on. In a population where everybody is a hawk, if one individual becomes a dove in the sense that whenever he finds another competitor, it will just take off and won't engage. All of a sudden, this individual is going to have fewer costs in terms of the interactions, and all of a sudden, it's going to be better off
because all the other hawks are busy fighting each other, killing each other, injuring each other, and when the dove finds a resource, finds a pile of food that hasn't been claimed, he can get it, but he's not injured. Is that
exactly?
Okay.
But exactly. But on the other hand, if you have a population where everybody's a dove, if you become a hawk, basically all of a sudden you're going to take over the whole all of the resources. Mm-hmm. So what's the best strategy in that sense? In a sense, what you end up with is a combination of both strategies. And you see, it's funny how once you start thinking about game theory and so on, you start seeing this everywhere. It's really interesting, a lot in terms of human behavior, but also in terms of animal behavior. But if you think about the evolution of Jiu-Jitsu, for instance, back in the day when people didn't do leg locks quite so much, all of a sudden, if you were really crappy leg locker, but still you could beat a lot of people that you wouldn't otherwise. But what we see nowadays is that basically it's not a differential. If you're an athlete that's very good leg locker, that's in itself is not sufficient. So basically, you have a strategy can be invaded by other strategies, and you won't see necessarily a convergence into one best strategy that's going to be best all the time.
Yeah. You see other things like when 50-50 came out, and people didn't have answers to it. You know, if you got the other guy in 50-50 and you were up by an advantage or by a couple of points, you were going to win. And then people started figuring out how to pass 50-50, and then the relative advantage of that position started going down. Still a good position, but it's not the fight ender, you might as well go home right now kind of position. And I think the leg locks thing is probably the best example. There was definitely a window, I want to say 5-10 years ago, when if you were I don't know, a purple belt with really good leg locks, you had a fairly decent chance of submitting a really good black belt if he was just competing under IBJJF rules and not having any kind of background in leg locks. Especially once you throw heel hooks into the game, forget about it.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting to think of basically the idea of game theory is that you start thinking about whether a strategy can invade a population that's homogeneous to another strategy.
For example,
basically, like what I mentioned before, if you want to know if a strategy is what we call evolutionary stable strategy, basically you need to know if population is homogeneous in one strategy, if you can invade that population using another strategy or not. If you can't, then the pure strategy is not going to be an evolutionary stable strategy. And oftentimes you can have either a pure strategy or a mixed strategy. And there's really interesting examples. There's a really cool example in nature, actually, of a rock, paper, scissors strategy of 3 different strategies in the same species of lizard. Basically, you have one lizard that has large territories, another lizard that has small territories, another lizard that won't defend any territories. It's like a sneaky male that is going to try to mate with the females, regardless of without having to defend territory. And what you see over the years is that you have a fluctuation of each one of these 3 strategies, and there's some really neat research on that, where you have the 3 strategies are going to go up and down over time, just because there's not a single strategy that's going to be the best.
Okay, so it's all the same species, and they're trying to defend their territories, basically to stop other males from mating with their females and having access to the resources in that territory.
Yeah, the main curiosity about this strategy is in this situation is that you have 3, but the situation with 2 strategies, that's super common. What we call satellite males. Yeah. You see that in fish, you see that in frogs. Yeah. So many species, even in mammals, you see species that like a male is going to hide in the bushes and wait for a strategy instead of having to defend a territory.
Yeah. It's a little bit tangential because it's not games theory, but I remember reading a study about bats, and the theory was that because bats are heavily constrained by how much they weigh, because they have to fly, they have to carry all that weight. So the researchers were positing that bats that lived in social settings would have to keep track of more social interactions, would have larger brains, and the other big variable that bats have is the size of their testes. So they'd figured larger brains, smaller testes. But it turned out it was the exact opposite. Bats that lived in large colonies needed larger testes and smaller brains because they would try to mate with all the females that were available to them in that social setting. So there's probably the same thing going on there, where some bats are more focused on defending their female or reproductive access to their female.
That's probably true in many species, but there's a really interesting case in terms of the vampire bat, which are very few species are actually vampire bats. But if you think about blood is a really crappy resource because it's mostly water, and their metabolism is so high that basically they will starve to death if they don't eat every single night. So basically, if they go out and they can't find any food, when they go back to roost, they're going to swap, or they're going to regurgitate, solicit regurgitation from other bats in the cave, and then they'll remember who were their mates, and then they can reciprocate on the other if the other guy doesn't find some food next time.
So it's the exact prisoner's dilemma.
Yeah, exactly.
Is it? Well, could you take people through the prisoner's dilemma, please?
Yeah, the prisoner's dilemma is a really interesting example where you have simple conditions that end up with very non-intuitive results. Basically, you can think of 2 people that were caught trying to commit a crime, but they weren't caught at the exact moment where they basically the police caught them afterwards, and they didn't have enough evidence to convict them. So basically, in this imagine that the police put each one of those people in two different rooms, and they start to get people to turn on each other. And basically, they have two choices. They can either cooperate and not turn the other guy in, or they can just cheat. And that's the idea. You can, what's the best strategy? Should you cheat and let the other guy take the blame, and then you're gonna be better off, or should you cooperate? In principle, it would be best. Intuitively, one might think that it would be best to cooperate, and then both people are going to be better off. But if you actually do the math, and if you play this one time, it's always better to defect. It's always better to cheat, which explains a lot in terms of a lot of human behavior in a sense. It's something called the strategy of the commons. Basically, if the cost is distributed across many different people, but the benefit only goes to yourself, then you should always, all else equal, you should always cheat. But there's a twist in the story. If you play the same game with the same person, then you can learn what they did in the previous rounds, and you can adjust accordingly. So there's this really interesting study a few decades ago where they got a whole bunch of people that they're working on game theory to submit their own strategy. So people can say, oh, I'm going to randomly choose if I'm going to cooperate at the beginning, and then I'm going to cheat at the end. And people submitted tons of different strategies. And they put each strategy to play against each other. And it turns out that the best strategy in that paper was really simple. It's called tit for tat. You cooperate on the first time, and then on the next times, you just copy whatever the other person did on the previous round. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that that's the ESS. That's the best strategy across those sets of strategies. That was the best strategy. But there's another interesting twist. It only works if you don't know when the game is going to end. Because if you know when the game is going to end, you're just going to cheat on the last turn regardless. Mm-hmm. And then if that's this common strategy, then another strategy could be to cheat on the first before the last, and then all of a sudden everybody's cheating again. So it only works if you don't know where the game is going to end. And that's interesting because you think about those end of the world movies. When people know that the world is going to end, what happens intuitively, what people think about is just going crazy and start destroying and looting and everything, because there won't be any consequence in the sense. Mm-hmm. And so sort of our social contract will break down as soon as we know when it's going to end. So yeah, game theory is interesting, but it's a bit disturbing because you start thinking about all the different contexts where it can explain a lot about our behavior as humans and also sort of things in nature as well.
Okay. So when we were talking about evolution, we're talking about variation, inheritability, and selection. Selection meaning that some things work better than others, and you're mm-hmm. going to have a greater chance of passing on whatever it is that you're doing. I mean, if I had to get a tattoo, I would probably be, the most succinct definition of evolution I've ever heard, which is the non-random survival of randomly varying replicators. I think that'd be a really catchy tattoo. Maybe if I put it in Latin, it would be classy.
Yeah, well, that's really good.
But how would that apply in Jiu-Jitsu? So you and I and 50 other people are in a school, and I develop a new method for collar choking you from the half guard. I'm making that up. Mm-hmm. So then how does this work?
You can think about the parallel of, for instance, if you have a mutation that works really well, for instance, you have some protein and you have a mutation that makes that protein better. If it only gets better results in the individual that got the mutation, but as soon as it passes on this mutation to next generation, where it's going to be mixed and matched with other types of proteins, if it's not consistently better across generations, it's not going to be selected. So if I come up with a choke or some submission or some sweep that is really, really good, but it only works for me, then it's not gonna be selected for. So, and this is the really cool thing about natural selection, which is by mutation and recombination, basically you keep on assessing the same mutations in many, many different backgrounds in thousands of individuals across thousands of populations. So it's a very, very efficient way to come up with the best strategies. And we actually use that on purpose in science. There's many different applications of this. For instance, if you have a very, very hard problem in computer science, and you can write down exactly the equations to come up with the best strategy. Basically, you introduce variation in those mutations, and you keep on selecting what's best. It's called it's what we call Monte Carlo methods. You randomly introduce this variation, and then it sort of reveals what's the best across all the variations. So there's an interesting parallel of the same technique that's going to be applied by different people in different conditions. And if it really works well in many different kinds of conditions, eventually it's going to be passed on. And there's interesting difference between biological evolution and cultural evolution in this case, in terms of Jiu-Jitsu, which is in Jiu-Jitsu you have a sort of Lamarckian inheritance, because you can actually pass on what you know, or you can directly, each individual can learn and it can adapt over a lifetime, which is not true for biological evolution. Basically, you can go to the gym as much as you can, but you won't pass on those big biceps to your children. Mm-hmm. But if you have some sort of cultural Lamarckian evolution, in the sense of you can pass on this information, then it's even more efficient. And there's also the possibility in biology you can have recombination, and you can have even hybridization of closely related species, where a whole chunk of one species is going to be transferred to another species, which in a sense is what
otherwise known as YouTube videos and instructionals in the modern. Because if you're in Brazil and you watch some crazy Russian sambo video, and you go, I like that, you didn't actually come in contact, but you incorporated that. It's almost like genetic recombination between species, or
exactly. And in a sense, a lot of MMA is basically mix and matching different strategies from different types of combat sports. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, there's a really interesting parallel between the way it happens in terms of cultural evolution, which is combat sports in a sense are a type of cultural evolution, and biological evolution in general.
So back when I was studying biology, it can be a pretty mathematically intensive field, because you can model a lot of this. You can count the number of genes. You can see the energy costs of this strategy versus that strategy. You can count the number of offspring in fruit flies, or like there's a strong mathematical emphasis. But then when the idea of memes was introduced, there's genes, right? Like you've got the gene for this, for blue eyes, or rather, you've got the gene for pink eyes. That's a discrete thing in your genetic code. Whereas a meme was I think it was Dawkins who introduced the idea that there are ideas in society that travel and propagate almost like genes. Do you know if that and now of course people just think of memes as funny things they share on Instagram, but it actually has a rigorous meaning. Do you know if that mathematical approach was ever applied to the study of memes?
Yeah, there's been quite a lot of research in terms of cultural evolution that uses that analogy. The main limitation in that sense is that if you think of a gene as a protein, it's something that you can actually look at, and you can sequence that, and you can characterize that really rigorously. Whereas if you have an idea, that's much harder to define. What's the unit of a meme in a sense? Is it a word, is it an idea, or is it an entire concept? I think that's the main challenge that people had, is what's the unit of evolution. In biology, we can have the unit of evolution is either like a mutation or a gene or a chromosome. But that's the main challenge of cultural evolution. That's also one of the reasons why it's qualitatively more complex. Because one convenient thing about biology is when you have different lineages that diverge, basically they become evolutionarily independent, and they have their own fates and their own destinies and so on. It's like a boundary between the genetic variation across different species. But in cultural evolution in general, these boundaries are much more porous. It's much easier to go across and to recombine and things like that. Okay. And it's not a limitation. It's not necessarily a limitation of the idea, but it's definitely a much more challenging phenomenon to model.
I ask because, in a certain sense, something like the heel hook could be considered a meme. It's an idea. Hey, I'm going to take your foot. I'm going to jam it in my armpit. I'm going to put my hand kind of here. I'm going to kind of pin your leg, and I'm going to kind of twist your foot relative to the rest of your leg. I mean, there's a million ways to fine tune that, and so what is this unit? But it's pretty easy to recognize a heel hook when you see it, and when you take a look at jiu-jitsu in the last few years, certainly, and now with the IBJJF legalizing leg locks at a higher level, if you look at heel hook as a meme, you can really see it spread through jiu-jitsu in the last couple of years in a very relevant way, I think.
Exactly. This brings us to another thing that I think that's a really interesting parallel between jiu-jitsu and evolutionary biology in general, which is nowadays people estimate that there's probably like 10 million species of animals or non-unicellular organisms. And it's interesting to think about that because most people think that that's a small fraction of all the species that actually lived on Earth. So,
sorry, you're saying just animal species, we're not counting fungi, we're not counting bacteria, we're not counting plants, just animal species.
I would say 10 million for non-unicellular, so non-bacteria and unicellular fungi and things like that. But that's probably 1% of all the species that ever lived. And if people also did some scuba diving at a reef or went to a rainforest, and if basically every leaf you turn is a different moth or a different frog or something like that, people are really fascinated with the diversity. But there's actually not fundamentally 10 million types of organisms. What we see once you start studying biology is that a lot of the diversity that we see is not actually fundamentally different between different organisms. For instance, back in the day, people would think of an organism like a clock, where you have each little piece being really fine-tuned to each other. And it's interesting how people use whatever was the most complex objects of technology and say the organisms are like that, or the brains. Many decades ago, brains are just like the telephone line, and then the brains became like the internet, and then the brain's going to be whatever is the top technological advance in a few decades. But once you look at underneath the hood, you lift the hood and see how this variation is actually generated. What you see actually is much more limited in the sense that nature is not like a clockmaker. It's more like a tinkerer, in the sense that you have the same tools being used over and over again. One really cool advance that we had over the past few decades is the discovery of a type of gene called the Hox gene. And these genes are really, really important to determine, for instance, where it's going to be the head or where it's going to be the tail, where you're going to have a brain or a wing or something like that. So these are fundamental genes that are expressed really early when you have just a few cells that are really important. And you're saying, these genes must be really conserved, because if you screw them up, you're going to end up with a monster or a completely non-viable organism. But it turns out that you see the same gene, for instance, in a butterfly, the same gene that's going to be determine where the head is going to be or a leg. Later on, when after you have the caterpillar and have the pupae, and then when you start developing the wings, the same Hox genes are going to determine, for instance, where the eye spots in the wings is going to be. So it's exactly the same tool being reused and rematched, mixed and matched in different conditions. And this combinatorial combination of this strategy, which is the main raw material for biology. So in a sense, is development or an organism is not like a clock where each piece is finely tuned to each other, but these genes and these components are more like screwdrivers or hammers or something like that. It's a tool that keeps on being used in different contexts, and even in contexts that you wouldn't expect.
Yeah. Well, I remember in the early days of COVID-19, somebody posted an article on one of the preprint servers going, look, this genetic sequence in COVID, in the SARS-CoV-2 virus, is exactly the same as the genetic sequence in HIV. Therefore, this virus must have been designed by man, and they just spliced this together, and there's HIV DNA or RNA has been put into this new virus. And this was forwarded to me by a bunch of very conspiracy-loving people. And then 3 days later, the authors retracted it and the retraction was, okay, we just realized that this DNA is in something like 70% of all organisms, and in half of all viruses, because it's one of the tools. It's like a screwdriver that a virus uses while it's being a virus.
There's actually a really fascinating example of a Hox gene called PAX5, which determines where the eye is going to be in an organism. And they did a cross experiment with a fruit fly and a mouse. Basically, they knocked out the gene, and basically the fly wouldn't have any eyes. And then they expressed the PAX5 gene from the mouse, and all of a sudden you had the normal eye. So you would never expect the eye of a fruit fly would have any component that's going to be similar to the eye of a mouse. But it turns out that the same tool has been used in many different ways. And also, if you think of when we're in college and we find all different sorts of applications for different things, you don't have much in terms of furniture and things like that. So probably you can have a hammer like propping up a TV or something that's completely unrelated to the original purpose, but it works, and that's what happens. So in development, basically you see the same tool being used sometimes in a completely different way. That wasn't the reason why it evolved to begin with many times.
So let's just go down the road of evolution a little bit, and I mean the classic argument against evolution, and I'm guessing in my listenership, there's a fair number of people who don't believe that in macroevolution anyway. They might say, sure, you could get a gray butterfly turning into a black butterfly, but you're not going to get a banana turning into a butterfly, regardless of the fact that bananas never turned into butterflies. They both came from some ancestor a billion years ago. Well, not. But how do we get to complex things? I mean, this Hox gene system sounds really complicated. It's probably actually a really simple system compared to the alternative.
I would say, to me, perhaps the most convincing evidence for evolution is not necessarily the genes that work, but for instance, the genes of the genome that probably don't have any obvious function. So for instance, there's probably half of our own genome is just repetitive elements that have, as far as we know, absolutely no function. And in many organisms, you can actually remove those regions, and the organism works just fine. And you see, basically, our genomes, a few decades ago, before this genomic revolution, we thought that there was a really simple correspondence between genome complexity and organism complexity. But then all of a sudden we saw that, for instance, onions,
Onions.
or any types of plants, or a fern.
Yeah.
Some ferns have gigantic nuclei. And then people thought, oh, maybe it's not the amount of DNA, is just the number of genes. It turns out that there's no relationship between the number of genes and complexity. There's some really simple or compact genomes that works really well, and there are some other organisms that have huge genomes, but most of it is useless. So, and what we discovered once we started sequencing all of these genomes is that a lot of our DNA is sort of a junkyard of old. It's like the fourth drawer in your kitchen. All sorts of things that you meant to throw away, genes that don't work, pseudogenes and transposable elements and repetitive elements, and all sorts of junk that doesn't serve any function, but it's sort of historical remnant of things that you were supposed to throw away, but you didn't, in a sense. And so if that has no function, why would those regions be similar across different organisms? And for instance, if you compare those regions that are not functional in humans and chimps, they're actually very similar. Once you start moving away in terms of the tree of life, those regions start becoming increasingly more different. So basically, you would have exactly what you would expect in a pattern of branching and diversification of species. And to me, explaining the non-functional for a creationist or an evolutionist skeptic, that's probably much harder to explain than a functional gene, because you say, oh, this is part of a common design or something like that. But why would the non-functional regions be similar as well? So to me, that's even more convincing.
So I know some of the people watching this are going to be confused because you're wearing a T-shirt that says "My King is Immortal" with a cross on it.
No, this is the name of our team, our Jiu-Jitsu team here in Curitiba.
Okay.
So,
okay.
Yeah.
All right. So it's not a religious affiliation, because a lot of people see it as like either I'm religious or I believe in evolution, and I think this is a ridiculous separation, or this is a ridiculous distinction, that either you believe in God or you believe that somehow the evolution happened. I mean, if you believe in God, then that God set up the rules by which evolution happens, and it was just a secondhand effect. Like, how do you run into a lot of resistance from the biblical literalists and fundamentalists?
Not as much as it used to. People people are we nowadays we are arguing with flat earthers, so the discussion went a few steps back. So that's probably one of the reasons why we're not arguing like biology. We're arguing some things that are even more basic. But a colleague of mine said that something that I think is really relevant, in the sense that the success of science was bought by the modesty of its ambition. So science is not supposed to be the answer to every single possible question. There's whole domains of human life that are completely outside the scope of science. Things like ethics and aesthetics and logic and even math are completely outside the domain of science. And one of the reasons why I think there's tension is that obviously there's people from one side that get a bit defensive, in the sense that, oh, my really deep beliefs are being challenged and I have to rethink about my faith and things like that. But on the other hand, you have people that are using science to make statements that are beyond the scope of science. For instance, people using science to make ethical claims. For instance, we see this all the time. For instance, in nowadays with the thing about LGBTQ issues in the sense that some people say it's natural, therefore it's right, and some people are saying that's not natural, therefore it's wrong. Both people are
It's
are wrong
natural for
because
chimpanzees to rip babies out of their mother's arms and bash them against trees and eat them. Like, that's natural
exactly.
too.
But I wear glasses. Naturally, if something that's not natural is ethically wrong, I'm not an ethical person because I'm wearing glasses.
Yeah.
So just like vaccines or industrialized food or even electricity, that's not necessarily natural. And you see both arguments. And you see commonly you see people saying things like. This supplement is natural, therefore it's really good for you. There's plenty of natural things that are really bad, like even snake poison is natural, but that's not necessarily good for you. And there's plenty of artificial things that are really good. For instance, insulin for people that are diabetic. There's not a natural thing that they're doing, but that's definitely keeping them alive.
Mm-hmm.
So that's called the naturalist fallacy. The fallacy of thinking that if something is natural, therefore it's good. If something is not natural, therefore it's bad. So that's one of the examples where people sort of abuse science to legitimize something that they believe in. And it's really important for people to separate what is science and what are the implications of science. And science, it's is necessarily neutral in many respects. The same process, the same knowledge that allowed us to have a particle accelerator and things like that was the same knowledge that made the H-bomb and all the atomic bombs that we have today. So the knowledge in itself is neutral. Whatever we choose to do with it is the issue. And that's the thing. Ethics is outside the scope of science. You can't do an experiment to show that something is right or something is wrong. It doesn't mean that you can't study people's ethical decisions and things like that. But that's not a scientific question.
It's a very Stephen Jay Gould argument that you're making about non-overlapping magisteria, that there's
exactly
fields that, which don't really not talk to each other is incorrect, because you could see how one would inform the other, but how they're sort of separate things. The field of ethics.
Yeah, it's important to use a tool, and it's for a lot of scientists, they think that everything that's outside science is outside reason, which is definitely naive. Philosophy, it's much older than science in a sense, and I lost count of how many scientists predicted the end of philosophy, for instance, over the years. It's very common to see this hubris of saying, scientific knowledge is becoming so vast that we don't need philosophy anymore. And that's particularly when you need philosophy the most, particularly nowadays when even the concept of truth is being questioned, and what's actual fact and what's evidence is being questioned. And that's where you need philosophy and ethics and epistemology so much more.
Well, you mentioned flat Earth, and I used to think that flat Earth was kind of cute. I mean, I thought that most of the people who are arguing for flat Earth were just trying to get a rise out of people. It's kind of like, I don't know, the pastafarians. They don't actually believe that there's a flying spaghetti monster, but they're doing it to irritate people, or they're doing it as an inside joke. And I think the last year has proven me completely wrong, that there really is a belief in flat Earth. And are you getting the same kind of level of disbelief? I'll call it fundamental science. I mean, the Earth is round, and it's a sphere. And
I actually have people in my academy that are flat earthers. So and they're higher ranked than me, so probably going to get some grief next time we roll. But I think the main I used to think exactly the same thing as you did, in the sense that there's probably innocuous, it won't change anything in real life. But there's some studies that suggest that the more you once you subscribe to one conspiracy theory, it's easier to to believe in the next one and the next one and so on. And for us in academia, the most challenging thing is that in science, basically, you present the evidence, and whoever has the best evidence eventually wins. But if you talking to conspiracy theories, in general, if you throw them facts, you have exactly the opposite effect. People will actually believe even more strongly in their conspiracy, because either you agree with them, or if you disagree, you're one of them that don't want you to, or either you're sheep or you're one of them that want to mislead you.
Well, they've rejected the idea of data fundamentally, right? Mm-hmm. And they've rejected the idea of falsifiability. I mean, any evidence that and if you're not working by those ground rules, then it's hard to see how you can argue somebody into a new position.
But to me, the even the hardest challenge is that in order to have, once you get beyond 4 or 5 or 6 conspiracy theories, they start to contradict each other. Mm-hmm. And so people get used to having cognitive dissonance. They're used to having this contradictory evidence. So all of a sudden, there's a conspiracy to kill Princess Diana, but at the same time, she was in on it as well. And then basically, you have people start getting used to and once you get comfortable with contradictory evidence, then it's trying to jump out of a hole with no bottom. Yeah. There's no basis for you to get out.
Yeah. Well, I guess it makes sense. You said earlier that if you believe in one conspiracy theory, you're more likely to believe in 2, 3, 4. And it makes sense because in order to believe, say, flat Earth, which I think is like the silliest one, there's probably sillier ones, but it's one of the silliest widespread ones. You have to believe that all of NASA is lying to you, all of the space agencies in every country are lying to you, that the satellite industry is lying to you, and that the people who program your cell phone are lying to you. I mean, it is, and so once you decide that a very large percentage of the world is lying to you, then probably every part of the world is lying to you. And once you've rejected this, once you've created this conspiracy, it would involve millions of people.
Exactly, and it's interesting because I actually met this young Earth creationist. They gave the name to a strategy that people use, which is called the Gish Gallop. Yeah. Which is
I saw Duane Gish use the Duane Gish Gallop in a debate. Really? Yeah.
That's interesting. So, for instance, if someone says to me that the COVID vaccine has a liquid chip, it will take me, I don't know, half an hour to explain them how vaccines work and how chips work, how 5G works, and then by then people will just present something completely different. Then it's a hopeless endeavor in a sense.
No, I saw Dr. Graham Bell, professor of evolution at McGill University, tried to debate Duane Gish, who was a far more experienced and bad faith debater. And so he would use the Gish Gallop. Well, what about this site in, in Arizona where the layers are upside down? What about this? What about that? What about this? What about this? What about this? What about that? What about... And like in his little 5-minute segment, stated 25 facts, and I'm using quotation marks. And each one of them is easily refutable, but it takes 10, 15 minutes to refute it. And so each piece of evidence that you present, it's that well-known fact that bullshit circulates, 10 times faster on the internet than truth.
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
This is part of why that's true, because it's to refute each individual thing is doable, but it doesn't, if you've had your first 5 things disputed, if you don't believe in fact, if you don't believe in authority, it doesn't really matter. So you refuted these 5. What about these other 15 things that I mentioned? It's crazy.
Exactly.
So to drag this back to jiu-jitsu, I just want to, you mentioned that in nature, there's only a limited number of body plans. I mean, ultimately, almost all animals are bilateral. They have a left side and a right side. They don't have three sides. I mean, there are a few examples of starfish and stuff that have got 8 sides or 16 sides, but most vertebrates, I think all vertebrates, have a left and right side. They've got a front end, they've got a back end. They've got a digestive tract that kind of starts at the front and ends at the back. If they have eyes, the eyes are more or less on the head. So when you think about jiu-jitsu, how do you think about these basic body plans of jiu-jitsu or of grappling in that context?
Yeah, one of the things that got me really fascinated with jiu-jitsu. So first I started with boxing and Muay Thai, but once you get a nerd training something like jiu-jitsu, it's an eye opener in the sense that you have this huge complexity in terms of guards and submissions and things like that, and throws and at first, I think for anyone who starts learning jiu-jitsu, that's really challenging and it's very daunting. But one of the coolest parts of jiu-jitsu is starting to see the same principles being applied over and over again. For instance, the triangle can be used in so many different positions in some different contexts, from the bottom, from the top, from side control, from the same thing with chokes, the same thing with lock or joint locks in general. Basically, the complexity is not because we have 10,000 different submissions. We have a relative few number of submissions, but the complexity of jiu-jitsu is by the combinations of different strategies in different orders, depending on timing, depending on details of where you grab the lapel and things like that. You can play around with different details in these modules, but you see the same modules over and over again. And to me, one of the most exciting and fun parts of jiu-jitsu is to recognize, this is actually the same position that you do in another context. And I think the combination, just like in biology, the combination of different modules is what gives rise to diversity. It's not every single individual is unique and different.
So in some sports, sprinting, the ideal or long distance running, there is an ideal body shape. But the ideal body shape for somebody who's going to run a good marathon at the Olympic level is pretty constrained. You're not going to be 185 pounds. You're not going to have an incredibly long upper body and very, very short legs. The ideal body type of somebody who specializes in bench press is also predefined. You're not going to have this super long wingspan, and you're going to have a very thick chest. And as you said, ping pong, right? You're not going to be 200 pounds. You're not going to be a Olympic weightlifter, a heavyweight Olympic weightlifter, and be playing ping pong. Not at an elite level. Do you think that the complexity of these different strategies in jiu-jitsu is sufficient, that there's room for the guy who's 6'6" and 180 pounds, and a guy who's 5'2" and 200 pounds to play and be competitive within that sport?
Absolutely. I think this brings us to another concept that people are starting to discuss in evolutionary biology over the past, 1-2 decades, which is the concept of evolvability. Evolvability is the capacity to evolve. And just like different organisms they have different potential to evolve because of the way they're structured. For instance, a bacterium is very limited in terms of the number of things that they can do. They can have huge diversity in terms of metabolism and types of substrates that they can decompose and things like that. But they won't produce an eye or a retina or lung or anything like that. Even in animals, you have, for instance, parthenogenic organisms, which are organisms that don't have sexual reproduction. Basically, most of their variation comes from mutation and not recombination. So when you look at the tree of life, these organisms that don't reproduce sexually anymore, they tend to have small branches in very different parts of the tree of life, which means that they are probably continuously being outcompeted by other organisms. So simply because they don't have the sexual reproduction, that decreases their evolvability. And if you think about combat sports in general, it's definitely there's definitely a lot of variation in terms of evolvability. The rate of change that you see in Jiu-Jitsu over the past few decades is unparalleled if you compare that, for instance, with Muay Thai or with boxing and things like that. I'm not saying that those sports didn't evolve and didn't change quite a bit, but comparably, I would say that no one would doubt that the rate of change has been super faster. And I would say that the reason why Jiu-Jitsu has been so much more evolvable is precisely because the way we organized different guards and different submissions and different sweeps in a way that you can recombine them, and not only that you can adapt that to the body type of different people. If you're short and stocky, probably a guillotine choke don't work as well against you than for some other guy that's tall and with a big neck and things like that. So both offensively and defensively, the best strategies are going to depend on the biotype of yourself and the other person.
Maybe it's because of the greater number of winning conditions. I mean, the winning conditions in Greco-Roman wrestling or freestyle wrestling are smaller. You can pin the guy or you can beat him with points. There's only a few ways that you can run up points. But in Jiu-Jitsu, I could catch you with a wrist lock. And which wrist lock? Well, there's 4 basic types of wrist locks. I could catch you in a shoulder lock. Which shoulder? Well, there's 3 basic ones, but there's a million different ways to apply it. I could catch you in an arm lock. You could catch me in a collar choke, a hand choke, a leg choke. You could sweep me from the butterfly guard and get a couple of points and win the match. I could sweep you from the half guard. There's, I think, a greater number of. It's less constrained. I mean, if in freestyle wrestling, if you went out and sat down on the floor, you'd probably you would lose very rapidly or be disqualified. I think there's maybe the number of potential ways to win has influenced the diversification within the sport. And then we get back to game theory. If everybody passes the guard on the knees, like a low pressure passing, and then you're the one guy at the club who does stand-up speed-based passing, you're going to do very well.
Mm-hmm. And going back to the other thing that you were saying, this is something we call optimality criteria. If you're optimizing some aspect of biological evolution or cultural evolution, whatever you're thinking about, the optimality criterion is the thing that you're trying to optimize. And I think you're right. The reason the fact that Jiu-Jitsu has many different alternative endpoints that are going to be a successful outcome means that you're going to be probably going to be much more diversified in terms of, because a lot of the things that we use in Jiu-Jitsu are borrowed from other grappling sports as well. But as you said, the fact that we have many different types of ways to determine if one person won or lost, that's definitely one of the reasons why we see this.
You're starting with a greater amount of diversity as well, right? Because you don't only have the Jiu-Jitsu, which was basically a form of judo, but if I see something in Sambo or I see something in an old Japanese Jiu-Jitsu book from 100 years ago, and I go, I think that might work. I can steal from that.
Exactly. And there's another thing that also has definitely affected the evolution of Jiu-Jitsu, which is particularly in relation to what you see in terms of evolution of MMA, was the time of a fight or a sparring match, which goes back to what I mentioned before in terms of game theory. If you know, and if you're close to the end, then his strategy is gonna change. And this is interesting because you start seeing this in the sub-only tournaments as opposed to the 5-minute or 10-minute tournaments. The strategies are completely different, and all of a sudden it's now worth doing the same things in different contexts. It's interesting how it changed the way people think about or their game plan in general.
No, it's true, and once again, it's a difference in the winning conditions. Marcio, this has been fascinating. If people want to, I don't know, do their masters with you on dwarf frogs in the Amazon, how do they get in touch with you, and how do they keep up with the research that you're doing?
Yeah, you can probably visit the website of my lab. It's called pie-lab.org, and there's papers and photographs of these strange organisms that we study. And if anyone wants to talk Jiu-Jitsu or talk biology, I would love to have this conversation. It's been a lot of fun.
Are you active on social media at all?
Just Twitter, yeah. A little bit of Instagram, but mostly Twitter.
And you're Marcio P or Marcio Pie on Twitter.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, and I look forward to maybe meeting you one day in person.
Excellent. Thanks for having me.